many people with bipolar that I meet, I find them to be very intelligent, sort of empathetic people and have really good qualities, but they've also been kind of thrown into a bit of disarray by the modern environment. And so I do wonder whether bipolar was in some way advantageous in a more natural setting. And I suppose THINK+SMART in many ways is like creating a more natural setting for people, natural food, natural light exposure, natural sleep cycles. So on a scientific level, I think it's the right approach.
I'm Hannah Warren, the Mental Health Communications and Advocacy Manager at Metabolic Mind. During the 2024 Bazooki Group Metabolic Psychiatry Retreat, we convened distinguished clinicians, researchers, and individuals with lived experience, working collectively to drive progress in metabolic therapies for mental health. During the event, I had the opportunity to speak with Dr. Iain Campbell, the Bazooki Research Fellow in Metabolic Psychiatry at the University of Edinburgh. Dr. Campbell holds a PhD in global health and was a principal investigator in a groundbreaking pilot trial on ketogenic therapy for bipolar disorder. As both a researcher and an early adopter of keto as a treatment for his own bipolar II disorder, he's a true pioneer in this field. I can relate to many of his experiences as someone who put bipolar I disorder into remission by implementing metabolic therapies. In our conversation, we explore Metabolic Mind's THINK+SMART framework for metabolic and mental health, with a deep dive into sleep and circadian rhythms, critical factors in maintaining mental well-being. I hope you enjoyed the valuable insights Dr. Campbell shares in this discussion.
Welcome to Metabolic Mind, a nonprofit initiative of Bazooki Group, transforming the study and treatment of mental disorders by exploring the connection between metabolism and brain health. Thank you for joining us on this journey.
Dr. Iain Campbell, it's so great to connect with you. Thanks for taking the time to meet with me.
Great to see you.
Yeah, it's great to see you as always. So I'm really excited that you carved out some time to talk to me about our new THINK+SMART model. So in essence, this is a tool where we're going to be able to harness kind of the incredible insights from our lived experience community and different ways that they're approaching metabolic therapies, kind of from a holistic perspective, not just ketogenic therapy, but other complementary things as well, like managing sleep, exercise, meditation, etc. My first question for you is about the think aspect of our model, which is therapeutic integration of nutritional ketosis. And while we know that there's a lot of these different complementary interventions that can support people in their implementation of ketogenic therapy, I'm really interested in your perspective as a researcher and someone with lived experience treating bipolar II disorder, kind of how do you think ketogenic therapy is going to ultimately transform the way that we understand and treat psychiatric conditions?
I think from lived experience perspective, I was always told things like exercise and all these different things would help bipolar. And I think you've also shared that before experiencing ketosis, I couldn't derive a lot of the benefit from these things. So I would try like intense exercise protocols and, really kind of meditation for like an hour at a time. I did a kind of a high intensity workout thing that was like an hour, and I would feel so exhausted and that I would feel physically ill by the end of it, but I still wouldn't get any mental health benefit. It was very frustrating because you felt like, all these things should really work. And similarly with meditation, trying to do like extended meditation periods, and it was quite helpful, but I didn't feel like it really was giving me enough remission to live a high quality of life. But it was interesting because when I went into ketosis and then I re-engaged in some of these behaviors, they all started to work for me in a way that they never had before. And actually then I did experience the kind of full benefit of all these different types of things, meditation, exercise. And I think it's just because when your brain is not running on the right fuel source, no matter how much you ramp up that engine, it's still running on the wrong fuel. And when you give it the right fuel source and you ramp up the engine through exercise, through different things in the kind of THINK+SMART model, these all become beneficial because your brain's got the right fuel to kind of make the full use of these things. So I think ketosis for me is kind of a foundational thing that also helps all the other things to work synergistically.
Yeah, absolutely. I've heard something similar from many people with lived experience. Like, I think Matt Bazuki and I both shared this, where we kind of were doing all of these different interventions, but it wasn't until we discovered ketogenic therapy as that cornerstone that could really help us to put our psychiatric condition into remission, like similar to you. And I felt really grateful, I guess, that I was kind of felt like I was primed for ketogenic therapy because I already had all of these positive metabolic therapies in place at the time when I finally discovered keto. And then it just kind of made everything click together and became that, cornerstone, like you said, a foundation. Right.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because so many people you see on bipolar forums, people doing these intensive exercise protocols, and people really want to survive this condition. People are unbelievably motivated, but they just don't have any energy to do all the things that are helpful. Energy to exercise, energy to eat healthy, energy to meditate. And ketosis seems to be kind of synergistic with all these things. And I think from an evolutionary perspective, it makes complete sense that that's the case, because for millions of years, all of life was fasting and going into ketosis for periods during the year for hunting and for foraging and for migration and so forth. And so these were natural states of human physiology when you were kind of needed to expend energy. So I think in humans, all these kind of pathways are preserved, and it makes sense why it would be helpful for humans as well.
Yeah, it's interesting because when you're in that kind of deep state of depression and you can barely get out of bed and you're struggling to brush your teeth, and people are like, it would benefit you so much if you would exercise. But understanding now that maybe our mitochondria aren't functioning properly and we're actually literally deprived of energy. It's not psychological, right? And if you don't have that energy reserve to tap into, it's very hard to force yourself to exercise.
Definitely. And it's funny you bring up the brushing the teeth example, because it seems preposterous to anyone. Like, how could you not have energy to brush your teeth? It seems like unimaginable. But I think it gives an indicator of how severe the depression is when you can't even feel the most basic functions of life. So some people will not be able to feed themselves. They have this kind of akinetic catatonia where they can't move really out of the room, and so it's not feeling sad, it's like a real physical crisis that the body goes into when you're in these depressions. And I never found anything that could significantly relieve it. I tried everything under the sun, and ketosis was the only thing that relieved that kind of profound metabolic depression that you experience. And so that then made everything else kind of possible on that kind of cornerstone, as you say.
Yeah, absolutely. And so then moving on to the SMART part of the model, I'd be really curious about your thoughts, because I know that both of us have the privilege of getting to meet so many different people with lived experience. And I found that a lot of people who are most successful with this really do have a holistic approach, and they do a lot of complementary metabolic therapies in addition to keto. So I'd be really interested in what you think of this tool and how it might benefit someone who's new to metabolic therapies.
Yeah, well, I think it's integrating so many areas that are very useful for patients. And I think a lot of treatment for bipolar has gone down kind of routes where we focus on very specific receptors and pathways. But really, when you meet a person with bipolar, they're a whole human being that isn't defined by just these small, reductionistic parts of themselves. They're a whole person that needs, quality of life and, health, relationships, exercise, a sense of purpose in their life, and you can't encapsulate any of these in one pill or one medication. So I think this is the best approach to helping people with bipolar, is seeing them as whole human beings that need to engage all these different aspects of life to be healthy. And I suppose a lot of the kind of funding was driven by if you find a receptor that has a target and you can develop a medication for it, then just unbelievable amounts of attention and research went into those specific pathways. And then that's fed back to the patient community as your condition is, for example, a chemical imbalance in the brain, or and this very reductionistic kind of way of viewing bipolar. And so I think with metabolic psychiatry, it's kind of relinking brain and body health, physical and mental health. I'm always trying to raise awareness about this fantastic thing called the neck, somewhat connecting the brain and the body together. They're not separate, but science has treated them that way for a long time. So I think this is a really great kind of holistic approach to it. Yeah,
and I'm hopeful that, like you said, when people with these conditions, they are complex people with the whole story and the whole history of how they experienced their illness and how they found recovery. So I'm also excited about how this tool will allow us to share stories and offer hope, because I think people can find a lot of inspiration when they hear the intricacies of someone's journey, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I think we've obviously spoken before on podcasts about your experiences and how you integrated these different, and I think that's so helpful, like coming from that perspective of seeing that it's not just one thing, but it's many aspects that contribute to your metabolic health. It is completely in line with the scientific perspective because, you know, we evolved under conditions of different light exposure and sleep and circadian rhythm changes and different foods. Our food sources varied throughout the year. There was all kinds of like metabolic challenges in the environment we adapted to. And I think that people with bipolar are particularly tuned into these things in a way that might have been beneficial in a natural environment, but becomes very detrimental in an artificial environment with artificial light, processed foods. So I like to many people with bipolar that I meet, I find them to be very intelligent, sort of empathetic people and have really good qualities, but they've also been kind of thrown into a bit of disarray by the modern environment. And so I do wonder whether bipolar was in some way advantageous in a more natural setting. And I suppose THINK+SMART in many ways is like creating a more natural setting for people, natural food, natural light exposure, natural sleep cycles. So on a scientific level, it's I think it's the right approach.
Yeah, that's a perfect transition into something I really wanted to talk to you about in more depth, because I know you've done a lot of research looking into circadian rhythms and sleep. So I was wondering what you think about the relationship between sleep disturbances and psychiatric conditions, and maybe some interventions that can help people to optimize their sleep.
Yeah, so when I was originally going into ketosis and finding it beneficial and looking to research this, I went and spoke to many professors looking for support to do research. And there was very few at the time that would take a call about, eating butter and bacon and things like this. It was very confusing for them. But someone who was incredibly supportive was Professor Daniel Smith, who's a circadian researcher, and had a lot of respect for his research because it was based very much on patient priorities and he was looking for real solutions. So he's really a domain expert in circadian science. And through working in his team, I've been involved in some of his circadian projects with the Wellcome Trust, Helios BD, Ambient BD, and we've learned a little bit about how circadian works in bipolar. And so I think that what I've learned from this is that sleep is very disrupted in bipolar disorder, but there's more kind of fundamental disruption of the circadian systems in bipolar disorder that are very kind of like at the root of bipolar symptomology. So one example would be when someone with bipolar goes to sleep, instead of progressing through the natural sleep cycle, you go down through a kind of series of stages of sleep through rapid eye movement, non-rapid eye movement sleep to deep sleep, and then you come back up again into REM dreaming sleep. And in bipolar, you're constantly jumping out of these states. So you're going down into one, but then leaping back up again. And then as you get to the next one, you leap back up to the waking state. So you're never getting a kind of really restful sleep. And so I'm sure many people can relate to this, but you wake up feeling very exhausted. You feel like you've been through a marathon, by the time you're ready to wake up in the morning. And it's because your body is fighting to try and get into this deeper sleep, and it can't. So that's very common in bipolar as one aspect of sleep disruption.
Well, for someone who has not yet started ketogenic therapy, like if someone with bipolar disorder was just trying to manage the issues they had with sleep, are there certain recommendations you would give to someone?
Yeah, so, I mean, unfortunately, I'm going to sound like someone's, granddad here giving them advice because it's just all the obvious points, but it really is about waking up early, going to bed early, trying to rise with the sun if at all possible, getting sunlight in your eyes in the morning. But I guess one thing that we're kind of learning more about is the profound effect that sunlight has, and to treat sunlight almost like a nutrient, to see that like you really need exposure to sunlight to be healthy to a certain degree. And so seeing sunlight as less like a kind of incidental thing and more like a nutrient that you intentionally, approach in the morning. And in the evening, you're getting signals from the environment about the sunset, and that's triggering melatonin changes in the brain that are preparing you for sleep. So when you're under artificial light environment, you receive none of these signals from the environment, and it's very disruptive to human metabolism to not receive those signals. So if you wear a CGM, for example, you'll see in the morning that as you wake up, there's a cortisol surge and your glucose spikes, and there's ways of managing that if you're rising early. But if you sleep in, that glucose surge, will be kind of detrimental in a way that it wouldn't be if you were up with the sunrise.
Oh, interesting. Do you think that there's a special benefit to morning exercise because of that? Because I always find that getting outside for a jog is optimal, and I'm sure part of that is getting the morning light, but also maybe the increase in cortisol helps with energy for exercise?
Yeah. I mean, I've definitely noticed that there's this cortisol surge about sort of 4 or 5 in the morning. The cortisol starts to rise, and this surges your glucose in the morning, and it's just part of a normal circadian rhythm. But in people with bipolar, and I've noticed it myself, it's particularly pronounced, like the glucose elevation. And so exercise really helps me to curb that for the rest of the day. But if I was to sleep in until 9 or 10, then that glucose surge would be happening with no energy expenditure, and that can be problematic for the body. So yeah, getting up early, exercising takes advantage of that glucose surge and uses it in the muscles instead of just kind of flooding the nervous system with glucose.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I was also wondering, after someone starts ketogenic therapy, do you know if there's a connection between ketogenic therapy and your sleep quality? Is there anything that changes? I've heard some people speculate, at least, that it can influence sleep quality.
Yeah, so I've heard many people say this, and I've just done a patient survey, and it was one of the most commonly reported aspects was sleep improvement. And so it's a complicated picture, because in the early stages when you're adapting to ketosis, some people can find it harder to sleep for a period because you're it's a kind of very high energy state. But then it tends, I think for most people, this tends to settle into improved sleep. So there's a kind of adaptation period that most people experience with ketosis that leads into generally improved sleep. And this is characterized by a kind of a phase shift towards the morning. So instead of kind of waking later and going to bed later, and this kind of is called a eveningness chronotype, which is kind of essentially when you're playing Call of Duty till 2 in the morning, as many people with bipolar are up late into the night. But really, when you go into ketosis, that sometimes shifts back for people, which is very interesting, and we don't know why that happens, and we need to do a lot more research in that area.
Yeah. I found keeping, a consistent sleep routine very, very beneficial, like having an early bedtime and getting up early in the morning and just sticking to the same times as much as possible. But then I've also found, doing ketogenic therapy, I'm at more than 3 years in now of using metabolic therapies as my sole form of treatment. I have found that I can be a little bit flexible because sometimes life does disturb our sleep routine, as you know, since you're here from the UK and the jet lag and everything you're dealing with. So do you have any recommendations for times where maybe because of some kind of work stress or factors beyond your control where your sleep would get a little disturbed? Is there any way to counter that, or what would you recommend?
I'm getting an education in this because I have a 2 and a 4-year-old at the moment, and sleep disturbances is part of life. So I think one of the interesting things is like you say about traveling. When you travel kind of west, there's a kind of higher incidence of mania in people with bipolar that when they travel to a different time zone where they're kind of phase shifting their sleep earlier in the morning, wakeful hours earlier in the morning, getting up earlier, going to bed earlier. There's an increased kind of energy, and this can even be predisposing to mania. And conversely, if you're going out west and you're shifting your sleep hours later, people can get more depression. But somewhere in the middle is the right fit for a circadian rhythm where you feel healthy. So it really makes a massive difference, your sleep phase. And what I found to work for myself personally is to wake up around the sunrise. I feel best when I wake up between 6 kind of 7 a.m. Around 7 a.m. is great, and going to bed by 11 is great. And there's many people who found this. Some famous examples would be like Paul Dalio, Ray Dalio's son. I think he has a tattoo that says "Go to bed before 11" on his arm, because it's a big part of his wellness. So many people have experienced the benefit of this consistent sleep schedule. And I think actually the thing that mediates it is the metabolic effects, because your metabolism is so closely interlinked with your circadian system that even if you're doing everything right with your diet, if your sleep is off, it has a very profound impact on your metabolism, even if everything else is correct. So getting the sleep schedule goes hand in hand with using things like ketogenic therapy, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And I feel like it's interesting, the more strictly kind of you adhere to that sleep routine and get optimal sleep, when there's any disturbance in it, I can really feel the difference in like my cognitive function on a day where I haven't had as good of sleep. So that's why, something simple, just like tracking my sleep with my Oura ring and being able to see those numbers, I think is really motivating to make sure that I follow through with a good bedtime.
Oh, you have an Oura ring?
I do. Yeah. What do you recommend that people track their sleep and their sleep quality?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good idea. Like, there's all sorts of devices now that can do this kind of passively. We're studying one in one of our studies that uses sort of radar detection, and it just sits in the corner of your room and it tells you about your sleep quality and sleep phases. And so the technology for doing this is really getting advanced now. And you can see in these, they're called hypnograms. They're it's like the kind of map of your sleep, the architecture of your sleep, and it shows the different sleep stages you go down through and then up through in the evening in cycles. And so there's basically kind of a sleep cycle is like going from the awake state down through the non-rapid eye movement states and down into deep sleep and then back up into rapid eye movement where you're dreaming. And you do this sort of 3 or 4 times a night, and it's supposed to progress very kind of reliably down through these stages, back up and then down again for 3 or 4 cycles. And as I say, in people with bipolar, they're constantly jumping back up to the waking state or the rapid eye movement state. And so it's like they're really fighting to sleep. It's quite common. So if you can see this on a graph, it can help you think about some ways of managing this. There's all kinds of sleep hygiene techniques that we could discuss. But essentially knowing that there's a problem in a hypnogram through using these devices is a really helpful way to understand your sleep quality.
You know, I'm so excited about what you're doing at the Metabolic Psychiatry Hub, and I'm wondering if this is going to give a lot of opportunities to link the research that you've done with circadian rhythms more with the metabolic psychiatry and ketogenic therapy, if you're going to be able to kind of study correlations.
Absolutely, yeah. And so we're studying this in a work stream of the Hub. So it is quite serendipitous because the metabolic research with the Bazuki group is now kind of, we're realizing there's like kind of profound connections between this and the sleep research that Daniel Smith has kind of launched at the university. And this is really, I think they do go hand in hand. And so we're now measuring metabolic markers in our sleep studies, and we're measuring sleep markers in our metabolic studies. And the more we look into this, the more it appears that they're very much hand in hand as significant aspects of metabolism. And I think it makes sense because if you think about sleep, you're really putting yourself into a kind of a lowered metabolism for a period of 8 hours, and then you're ramping back up your metabolism to cope with the day. So, I mean, it's really the most profound metabolic shift that happens to humans on a continual basis. So they're clearly very interlinked, metabolic function and sleep quality.
And it's interesting how you mentioned kind of granddad advice. And I find that so many of the things that we learn really are kind of practical things you intuitively know, but somehow seeing that data can really reinforce the right decisions. So like one of the things I realized early on when I started tracking my sleep with Aura was just how much like a big meal before bed would impact my sleep quality. So something as simple as finishing my last meal later or earlier in the day and having it be a lighter meal can make a huge difference.
Definitely. Yeah, absolutely. And like timing of meals, there's these. So I guess one less granddaddy thing that's a bit more high tech I could share is that there's these things called Zeitgebers in the environment that trigger your sleep system. So you're kind of, there's a part of your brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, and it kind of defines your sleep quality and your circadian rhythm. And it's always tracking things in your environment. So it's always looking for inputs from light and from food and it's using that as clues to kind of pulse your circadian system. So it's sending like these pulses of melatonin, different hormones to regulate your sleep. And so it's looking for when you're eating, what time you're waking up and getting sunlight in your eyes in the morning. And it also, interestingly, there's things like social interaction that it appears to track. So the first time you speak to someone in the morning, your brain registers this as a signal about how its circadian function and therefore metabolic function should work that day. So the concept of Zeitgebers is very far back in bipolar research. There's a lot of research on this being influential. So if you can think about your activities as you're giving signals to your circadian system about when your energy should be high and when it should be low, when you should be preparing for sleep. And these are light, meal timing, the type of foods you're eating, social interaction, things like this.
Mm-hmm. You know, one thing I've never experimented with, but I've heard a lot of positive things on from other people with lived experience is using blue light blockers. I was wondering if that's been something that you've looked at in your research or something that you've personally utilized.
Yeah, so I use kind of the screen filters and the red light, and I've tried blue blocking glasses. And I think it makes a lot of sense. There's not fully established research showing that it's effective yet, but from patient experiences and speaking to patients, it's been very useful in a lot of people that I've spoken to. So I do think it might be that the research will show this is very helpful in time. So I've used them myself, and the kind of logic is in the morning when you wake up, you kind of receive red sunlight from the sunrise. The color of light is different, the quality of light is different. And again, these are signals to your circadian and metabolic systems. And if you don't receive this, then you don't get that same cue about your metabolism ramping up in the morning to prepare you for the day. And similarly in the evening, the light color changes to kind of a kind of red or orange color in the evening. And again, it's a signal to your circadian system to release melatonin to allow you to go to sleep. So in an unnatural light environment, you're not receiving this kind of dynamic of different colors and qualities of light throughout the day. And so it's an attempt to try and artificially recreate those stimuli. So I think it makes complete sense, especially for people that are manic. They might be receiving signals that are discordant and causing them to become manic. And similarly with depression, bright light therapy can be quite effective. And I find this to be true. Getting sort of a higher level of light exposure can be quite helpful in the depressed states. So I think light therapy plus blue blocking glasses is a kind of artificial way to recreate a natural environment, if that makes sense.
I'm really excited to see all the research that's going to be coming out of the Metabolic Psychiatry Hub. I'd really love to hear your thoughts on kind of the challenges that are unique to this field, because we're looking at so many interconnected therapies, that are kind of mind body. You've talked before about it being holistic and related to the person. This is just not the way that science has been conducted in the past. So I'm really curious what you think are going to be the challenges and opportunities from being able to grow this field.
Yeah, I think the kind of mind-body split, like you described, is particularly a problem in psychiatry. And it really goes back to the earliest days of psychiatry. Emil Kraepelin was considered kind of the founder of modern psychiatry, and he believed in the biological basis of mental illness, that it's all based in the brain and biology, and by understanding that we can treat these conditions. But Sigmund Freud was a kind of neurologist who very much subscribed to this Kraepelin school of understanding of the biological basis of mental illness. But he saw that they weren't making progress in treating patients, so he became a psychoanalyst and did a lot of really interesting research in this area. But it kind of made this split between understanding the physical and biology aspects of mental health and the kind of mind and psychoanalysis aspects, and they became kind of separate trajectories. And this led then to separate kind of departments in universities for physical health and mental health and brain and body. And this kind of then went down into, really was a strata that ran right through the academic and clinical and research systems, that you treat physical health and mental health as entirely separate modalities. And I think why lived experience, like you describe, is so important is because in the lived experience of patients and the biology of patients, all these conceptual distinctions dissolve into someone who's a whole human being who's experiencing physical and mental health symptoms at the same time. And so lived experience brings a kind of connection to reality, a biological reality that we haven't had in science, and it dissolves these distinctions we make into kind of holistic treatments. So in the hub, we've got people from cardiovascular science. It's a kind of expression of this by bringing cardiovascular experts, metabolic experts, psychiatrists, and neuroscientists into a group together to talk about how can we treat this as a whole body person, as opposed to just a brain in a jar type scenario that we've had in psychiatry for a long time.
Another thing I love is I understand that you're making the lived experience community really integrated into the research that you're doing, that they're helping to direct kind of what the priorities are, and that you're engaging them in an involved way in shaping the issues that you're going to be looking into.
Yes, it's something I know it's very important to yourself, and likewise as a patient. I think because we've been through those like terrible states that you experience in bipolar, and you inherently never want anyone to experience that. It feels very much like you hit the very bottom of what human suffering can feel like to some degree, at least psychologically, and you just don't want anyone to ever go there. And so the motivation is very much from the suffering that you've experienced making THINK+SMART, and I've experienced, and the people in our groups have experienced. We all have that common feeling of like we want to protect anyone from getting where we went to, and so I think that gives us a great degree of kind of clarity about our direction and what the priorities are for research and how to really help people in a meaningful way.
I think it's really unique in this field that you meet so many people once they've transformed their own lives. They feel so motivated and driven to raise awareness and help other people. And it just is so incredible because I think they are really going to be the ones to advance and push the science forward through those advocacy efforts. Right?
Yeah, I think in the history of kind of psychiatry and mental health research, there's been sometimes it's become highly conceptual and detached from patient priorities, exploring lots of receptors and targets and things that aren't necessarily going to lead to new treatments. And so this is a great opportunity to go down a different road and have patients really define research trajectories that will result in new and helpful treatments for patients. And there's a lot of benefit to improving physical health in people with mental illness. That's kind of like low-hanging fruit. We can already do things and introduce interventions like a ketogenic diet and other things that are useful to treat metabolic health. So if we start there, we can make a lot of ground just by using things that we already know can be helpful, like in THINK+SMART. And I think this is what patients really need at the moment, is practical and helpful advice and treatments that are grounded in science and lived experience.
Absolutely. Well, I'm such a huge fan of your work, and it's incredible to see all the progress you've made in such a short amount of time in getting the Metabolic Psychiatry Hub founded. And I know you're going to be doing really pioneering work there. I can't wait to follow the research that you're doing and your ongoing progress in this field.
Thank you. And I'm really excited about your work and looking forward to collaborate with you on these projects.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Iain.